Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our conference, The Philippines, Spain, and Globalization, 16th Century to the Present. And we are now in session 5, the last session for day 1. We have here panel 5 titled Global Trade and Changing Imperatives, and we are delighted to have 4 presenters for this panel. I'll introduce them briefly and let them speak one after the other immediately after my introduction. First, we have Juan José Rivas-Moreno, who will deliver a paper titled Religious Funds and Trade Financing in Manila, an Alternative Institutional Approach to Early Modern Long-Distance Trade, 1668 to 1838. The next presenter is Vergel with a paper titled Global Official Policy, the Bourbon Reforms, and the Expansion of State Power in the Maritime World. And our third presenter is Ronald Allan L. Cruz, whose paper is titled Animal Trade in the Philippines during the Spanish and early American colonial periods, based on primary historical texts. And the last presenter of this panel is Ferdinand Philip Victoria. His paper is Opium to Mindanao, Revenue Farming in the Southern Frontier of the Spanish Philippines, 1851 to 1899. And so I now turn you over to Juan José Rivas-Moreno for the first presentation of this panel.
So thank you very much for having me here. What I'm going to present today is an article that is based on the thesis that I'm currently writing, which is on the financing of the Manila Trade during the long 18th century. And this article is specifically about the role that the religious funds play in the financing during this time period. So what I'm gonna do today, if this moves, is that I will start with the research question. So how is this trade being financed? How does it differ from other trades at the time? Why does it differ? What are the implications? And then I'll get to the arguments, so the hypothesis that I think explains what we observe happening in Manila. Then I'll talk about the literature, the sources that I'll be using, and I'll get to the article proper. So when it comes to the Manila trade, we all know about the famous Manila galleon that Cruz wrote about, the one single galleon that sailed across the Pacific for over 250 years, linking Spanish America with Asia through Manila. But it's when we put it in a more global and comparative perspective that we start realizing that a lot of questions emerge, especially when compared to what is going on the other side of the world at the time. So with the emergence of the joint stock companies, the English and the Dutch East India companies. And that leads to several questions. And one of them, the first one, is probably why does the Manila trade never integrate? So why does it never adopt the joint stock company form? And this is important because time and again, historians have pointed to the emergence of joint stock companies and the related spillovers like stock markets and tradable shares as one of the main factors that is enabling sustained long distance trade during the period and the first wave of globalization. Now, when it comes to the Manila trade, not only does it never integrate, over its 250-year-long history, it manages to successfully defeat all the challenges from the English and East India companies and from the very joint stock companies that the King of Spain sponsored himself. So that is one big question in general. How are they managing to maintain this trade unchallenged for over 250 years without adopting this supposedly more innovative and sophisticated institutional framework? A second question is, how do they mitigate the fundamental problem of exchange, which is basically agency risk, the risk of cheating, of skimming profits, of embezzlement, etc., which is also a fundamental question for the emergence of financial markets. And the third question is probably the most obvious one, which is why just one single ship? Well, why does this trade rely on the sailing of one single ship? So we know that this trade was big. It transported an estimated 50 to 70 annual tons of silver across the Pacific. It was a profitable trade and it lasted very long. So what really is the point of having one single ship? Why restrict yourself to that? Especially because with one ship, you cannot diversify the risk across ships, and therefore you're pretty much excluding the possibility of having premium insurance business, which is another factor that is driving the growth of trade, especially in the 18th century in the Atlantic. So as you can all see, each one of these questions is really addressing fundamental topics that the historians have identified as triggering this first wave of globalization. But the interesting part is that all of these models break down when they apply to Manila. So I think that the Philippines in general have a lot to say about the history of early finance and of the first wave of globalization. And it all really boils down to this main question, which is, so how are these people managing? How exactly are they financing this trade? What is the alternative model that they're using? So my arguments, my hypothesis is very much related with political economy. What I suggest is that what defines the Manila trade really is the existence of a coordination failure across the broader Pacific exchange. That is the result of the Manila-Acapulco crossing, that specific part of the Manila trade, being the exclusive privilege of the citizens of Manila. What this means is that the city as a whole has a stake on the trade. They live off the rents that are derived from their intermediary role. So when the Manileños design their financial markets, they gear them not towards market integration or market efficiency or mitigating price volatility. The main purpose is actually to protect that privilege, to protect that intermediary role. Because at the end of the day, in the broader Pacific trade, a silver trade, Manila is mostly an intermediary that can easily be bypassed. So they prevent this by offering something in return, by making Manila indispensable. And they do so by making Manila the risk manager. Manila specializes as a risk manager. Manila internalizes and distributes all the risk inherent in the Pacific exchange, so that to both the Asian and Mexican merchants at the ends of the trade, they're basically providing them with the done deal. And we'll see how they do this. When it comes to the literature, I really want to point out just one thing that is very important, which is that it seems there to be a massive divide between those historians that talk about the Asian leg of the Manila trade and those that deal with the American leg, in the sense that even when they specialize on one of them, they usually just give passing reference to the other. And I think that this is the result of two things. The first one is the coordination failure itself, because even though both legs converge in Manila, you will see that they're organized in a completely radically different way. And the second thing, I think it has to do with sources. So even though there is a wealth of sources regarding the Spanish Empire as a whole, when it comes to the Manila trade, we are really lacking sources that are produced by the trade and for the operation of the trade that can help us put Manila at the center of the analysis. And that is something that I really want to address in my thesis as a whole and in this paper specifically. So I'm going to be using the more orthodox sources and the orthodox archives, but there's two corpus of sources that I really want to talk about. The first one is a collection of 505 sea-long contracts extending 33 years of the 18th century that are from the notarial protocols of Manila that are kept in the National Archives of the Philippines, which I haven't been able to visit because the pandemic happened. But lucky for me, there's microfilms available for consultation in Madrid. So that was good, at least. The second main body of sources is a collection of 23 year-on-year account books from 23 legacy funds that were under the management of the Tertiary Order of St. Dominic in Manila. Now, to the best of my knowledge, these are the only surviving account books from Obras Pías that I know of. So that's interesting. So without further ado, let's get into the article proper. So when it comes to the Manila trade, in essence, it is not too dissimilar from the trade of the English and the Dutch East India companies in the sense that it is what is called a silk for silver trade. So that is Asian goods and manufactures for Spanish American silver pesos. Now, the main engine of this trade are the massive resource endowment differentials that exist between both regions. So to give you an idea, in the 1800s, Spanish America is producing over 80% of the world's silver, while its population is estimated at something around 12 million people. In 1750, Asia is lacking any meaningful sources of silver, but just the population of China has got 315 million people. So you can see the massive skewedness of the per capita supply of silver which probably also indicates a massive relative price differential of silver between both regions. What it also means is that the trade is hugely profitable. So Cruz estimated profits of 300%, but that was just Cruz throwing a number. Bernal used primary sources and he estimated something around 1,100% or 1,300%. With my own estimations, I've seen that profits of 1,000% would not be rare, really. And which also, again, brings it back to the one single galleon. If this is so profitable, why would you restrict it? But having said that, when it comes to the organization of the Manila Trade, we can really see the impact of the coordination failure. So the Manila Trade had two legs. It had the Asian leg, which is here represented by the black lines. And this is basically merchants from all over Asia that come to Manila to sell their goods and buy the silver pesos. And then it has the American leg, which is the famous Manila Galleon, which is the red line, which is the one galleon that is freighted by the citizen and sails every year to Acapulco and back. Now, in here is visible the difference between both trades. The Asian trade is virtually open to all. The goods come from all over the place, and so does the financing. It comes from everywhere, including Manila. When it comes to the American leg, the only ones that participate are the citizens of Manila that freight the galleon, and the financing is almost exclusively coming from Manila. So the coordination failure that results from the privilege is also very evident when you put the transaction map of the broader Pacific exchange. In such a map, you would have at both ends of the exchange, the Asian and Mexican merchants that are ultimately buying and selling the goods and the silver, but their role is circumscribed to their respective fairs. Now, the ones that are truly intermediating between both are the galleon freighters, which is a group of 40 or 50 wealthy citizens that are freighting the galleon year on year. But there is an added transaction to this, which is that they have to buy the laden space in the galleon from their own neighbors. So the way it works is that the whole of the galleon is usually divided into 4,000 shares or so, and that are distributed to the citizens. But most citizens choose not to freight themselves. Instead, they sell their share to the wealthier freighters to what essentially is a risk-free pension. Now, this transaction is completely defined by municipal boundaries. It's a rent that is given basically because of citizenship. And what it also means is that the galleon freighters have to incur very heavy outlays before they can even sail to Acapulco. Because not only have they got to buy the goods from the Asian merchants, they also have to buy the laden space from their own neighbors. And for that, they need financing, and that financing is provided by the Obras Pillas, so the legacy funds. So these legacy funds are basically testamentary funds that are under the jurisdiction of canon law. The way they work is usually that a wealthy citizen of Manila, when they die, they will leave a certain amount of money in their testament to whatever confraternity or brotherhood they belong to, or the House of Mercy. And that money is invested in the trade, and the proceeds will go to pay for charity on behalf of the soul of the donor. And that means two very important things for our story here. The first one is that for the time and place, Manila has a massive welfare system. So the proceeds of legacy funds pay for hospitals, for orphanages, for schools, for universities, for dowries, for the salaries of professors, doctors, priests, everything you can imagine. And the second thing that is really important is that because this welfare state ultimately relies on the proceeds of the legacy fund, which means that they rely on the interest rates that they can charge in the sea loans that they originate. So there's that very strong link. Now, legacy funds are common all across the Hispanic world, but only in Manila have I seen legacy funds that directly invest in the trade by originating sea loans. These kinds of funds emerged in 1668, with the first one being created in the House of Mercy, but they spread very quickly because they're quite successful. So I have got individual level data of over 180 funds for the long 18th century, but I have counted over 220, and I estimate that there must be something around 250 to 180, which is a lot. It basically is a lot. The way the governance works is because these legacy funds are left to the management of the confraternities and the brotherhoods. They're loosely related to the religious orders they are related to. But what really matters for us is that each one of these confraternities has its own governing body that is called the Mesa, which are the ones that decide who to lend to, how much to lend, and at what interest. Now, the Mesa is supposedly chosen from the broader membership of the confraternity year on year. But in reality, the people that are sitting in the mesas are the same 40 or 50 guys and their clients that actually frighten the galleon, that are the members of the consulado later on. It's always the same people. Now, the way they operate is that they originate sea loans, which are a very interesting instrument. So this instrument is extremely ancient. It goes back all the way to ancient Greece. It is native to both Europe and Asia, and probably Africa too. What it is basically a credit and insurance hybrid. So the way it works is that a lender will give a loan to a borrower for him to buy merchandise and freight it in a specific ship. And this is so because the loan is only repayable upon the successful return of that ship. So it has an element of insurance, and what it basically is doing is that it's transferring the risk of loss at sea to the ultimate owner of the money, which in Manila is very likely not just a very well-capitalized fund, it's also a well-capitalized fund whose owner is dead. So that is very important. What is also very important is that precisely because of this element of insurance, sea loans are allowed to charge a higher interest rate. So in the 18th century in Manila, this rate is hovering around 20 to 50%, with 30% being the mode, which for the kind of trade that it is and the kind of instrument is actually quite low, although in absolute numbers is a high interest rate. So now that we know all of this, we get to the nitty-gritty of risk management. So there's really three kinds of risk that seriously afflict early modern long-distance trade in the age of sail. There's the risk of loss at sea, which is quite self-explanatory. There is market risk, which is the risk that you'll buy something at a certain price and then reach your destination port to find that it's selling at a tenth of the price and that you're bankrupt. And then there is agency risk, which, as I said, is the risk of cheating, scheming profits, embezzlement, and all of this. Now, I really want to focus on the first two, because here you can truly see the impact of the religious fund financing model. So when it comes to the first one, we've already seen that the risk of loss at sea is being transferred from the merchant to the owner of the money. And this is important because the owner of the money is not only a capitalized fund and diversified, the owner of that fund is very likely dead. And that is really crucial because when the bad times come, dead people usually don't panic. In fact, dead people don't usually do much. But this is crucial because if you know a bit of early banking, especially in the US and the UK, panic runs at banks are an absolute killer. And in here you have basically bulletproof banks in which the depositors are never going to panic and take the money out because they're dead. Then you have market risk, which in this context, the nature of the Manila trade is pretty much preventing this to a very big extent, because silver being so unevenly distributed and also silver being inorganic, meaning that you cannot grow alternatives anywhere else, you're pretty much guaranteed that there will never really be a price convergence between both regions. The real danger, though, is that precisely because Latin American markets are so thin, they can easily be glutted with Asian goods. And in here, the one galleon system actually makes a lot of sense, because it is a way of restricting the supply of goods and therefore creating artificial scarcity. And what that means is that you can keep a certain price difference, which also means a certain profit margin. And as we have seen before, the religious funds and ultimately the welfare of the city relies on the interest rates that they can charge, which relies on these profit margins. And precisely because the main drawback of this system is that the one single galleon very much increases risk. There is really no drawback to that in the sense that that risk is being directed towards the debt, towards the owners of the fund. So having this one single galleon is a way of maintaining that profit margin while transferring that risk away. It does make sense in this context to an extent. So going back to the beginning, what we said about these capital markets being geared towards taking the risk, we can really see that when we check on the annual returns of investments of these funds. which is something around 5 to 7% for the time. Now that is really good return for today, but in the context of a trade whose profits are estimated at something like between 300 to 1,000, that is almost nothing. And the main purpose is because these funds are really being geared towards taking the risk. So they incur heavy losses because they're internalizing all of that risk. And the main purpose is to manage that risk and to provide a continued access to capital so that people can keep borrowing and participating in the Acapulco negotiation, which is the one that actually brings in the profits. So I don't think I have much time. So I'm going to skip over the conclusions because they're exactly the same thing as at the beginning. So Manila specializes as the risk manager. That's what they're geared to. And I want to talk instead about the implications. And the implications you can only see properly when you put the Philippines and Manila at the center of the map. Because when it comes to the first wave of globalization, what we have to bear in mind is that the main motivation was not market integration or market efficiency at all. It was monopoly and intermediation. That is what charter company actually means. And in this map, we see that the English and the Dutch are stuck with the least efficient route. It's the one that has to take the money all the way from America to Europe, across Africa, and eventually to Asia. And even though they have the help of the stock exchanges, of their own governments, of armies and navies, they never manage to monopolize the least efficient route. But in here, you see that the more efficient route, the one across the Pacific, is being monopolized, unchallenged almost, for 250 years by 40 or 50 guys that are sitting in Manila. This is really a testament to the incredible resilience of the institutional framework of Manila. And it's also very important because it really puts it in a perspective in which stock exchanges, price convergence to the extent that it happened, was actually a spillover of this first wave of globalization. While the history of the Manila trade actually, and the history of the financial markets of the Manila trade, the problem we have here is really that it's the story of a massive success, not the story of a failure. These guys are actually succeeding where the English and the Dutch are failing consistently for over 250 years, which is to monopolize the more successful route. So thank you very much. That was the presentation. So now it's open to questions, comments, insults. Yeah.
So I'll be presenting today the global official policy, the Bourbon Reforms, and the expansion of state power in the maritime world. Okay, as an overview, I'll give you the conclusion. So basically, I'm tackling here the foundation of Escuela Nautica. Now, why was Escuela Nautica established? The reasons, basically the Bourbon Reforms. The factors were the free trade, export agriculture, the ennoblement of piloting, and finally, the global official policy launched by the Spanish Royal Navy. Okay, in common knowledge, the knowledge on Escuela Nautica is largely only what people know is only what scholars know is only a short institutional account, whether foreign or local scholars. Now, I will show here that that instead of not only focusing on the local conditions of the Philippines, I also share that.
Philip, sorry, can you go to the slideshow mode so that we can see your slides better? So please click F5, press F5 or click on slideshow so that we can see the slides better. Thank you.
It's there? Okay.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Philip.
Now, okay, in regards to the Galleon Trade, it was the main commerce. Oh, sorry. Damn it. Could we pause this? Okay, it's the main commerce of the Spanish Philippines. It's the main maritime and economic endeavor. So basically, the colony was one shipbuilding and a dry docking port. Now, as we see from the history of the Galleon Trade, there was already it encountered many nautical problems, and unfortunately, a nautical school was not established as as was seen in the history of the Galleon Trade. A technical impetus was not enough. Now, uh, of before the 19th century, I mean before the 18th century, there was only one. There was only pitch, only one pitch for a navigation school that we know. It was from the founder of Colegio de San Juan de Letran, Juan Alonso Jeronimo Guerrero. Now he requested that he believed that the students, its graduates of Letran became soldiers and priests, but he also believed that they could become pilots. So in asking for funds, he requested that his school could also expand to nautical education. But unfortunately, it was denied. Now, now, what's important here now is in the 18th century, there was a change in the monarchy in Spain, and the Bourbon reforms was there was the Bourbons implemented reforms in Spain and the empire for almost of entire of the 18th century, but in the first half, uh, 1700, but at the first half, Spanish interests were directed towards Europe. It was only during the reign of Carlos III that he would also now focus on at the colonies. Now, but the policy shift would push to the extreme due to the 7 Years' War. We know that Manila and Havana, if I remember, was invaded by the British, and that was a humiliation for Carlos III. Now, the implementation of the free trade came in 3 stages. First was in 1765. It was in here he expanded here. Carlos III instituted the free trade with the Spanish Caribbean. Unfortunately, in the following year, the elites revolted. They were afraid of the changes. And since then, the reforms halted in Spain, and they were largely concentrated in Spanish America. And nevertheless, by the 1770s, there was increase in trade thanks to the initial opening. So by 1778, there was another edict of free trade, and it covered most of Spanish America. And by 1789, Mexico and I think Peru, the last holdouts were finally included. It covered the whole of Spanish America. Now, okay, the same pattern could be seen in here in the Philippines, but it came also in stages. First one was to the Real Armada. Then, but these were not very successful. And there was also, again, then Spain also enticed private ventures. And then finally, it was to the efforts of the Royal Philippine Company. Now we have to emphasize here the role of the Spanish Royal Navy, because when it comes to the Bourbon reforms, the role of the economic societies and the merchant guild is already well known. Both stimulated economic reforms, both improving local infrastructures, and established and improved technical education. And in some instances, they established nautical schools. Okay, what's important here is the revival of the Royal Armada. Remember in the 17th century, it was destroyed by the English Royal Navy, and the assertion, and we saw witness the assertion of English maritime power. Anyway, what's vital for the revival of the Spanish nautical science was the establishment in 1717 of the Royal Academy of Midshipmen of Cadiz. This was schools for the elite. Now, as we mentioned earlier, that Carlos III issued free trade, and these edicts of free trade unleashed a significant increase in commercial shipping and exorbitant demands for pilots. Okay, as mentioned by Marta Garcia Garalon. Now, the role of the Royal Navy would be seen would see its pinnacle with the the 8 July 1787 Royal Decree. A global official policy was launched. Nautical schools would be open in all of Spain's coastal merchant guilds and in the open ports. And another thing is that we saw an empire-wide streamlining of the curriculum. It was now supervised by the Royal Navy, the Spanish Royal Navy. Now, one of the efforts done by the Bourbon Crown was ennobling a disdained profession, because previously, for much of the 16th century, there was a derision for seafaring in the Spanish society. But in the 17th century, there was a policy shift by the crown. Unfortunately, this was rejected by the elites. So what the crown did instead was that it just supported the opening of the Royal San Telmo Seminary College of Sevilla. This was a school for orphans and the poor, so that they could pursue. It offered nautical education because for the needs of the empire. And another thing, by the 18th century, another problem encountered was the creation of the pilot corps of the Armada. Remember, in 1717, we saw the Guardia Marinas. It was a school for the elites, and by 1748, it seems that there's already enough. There's already numerous graduates. unfortunately, this pilot corps also had a disdain for their for the pilots not serving in the Navy. They also look down upon the profession. Well, anyway, but still, by 1781, the Bourbon Crown promoted the status of pilots. They were categorized as a class of war officials, and they were also given the title of Don.
Hi, Philip. Sorry,
Yes.
excuse me. May you please wrap up your discussion in around 3 minutes,
Okay, 3
in the
minutes.
interest of time. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, now in seeing here in the Spanish Philippines, the Bourbon, we also see the Bourbon reforms taking place by the 1790 with the opening of Manila, and thanks to the company, which it would receive, the Royal Philippine Company would have the finally have its would open Manila until further notice in 1803 by the Treaty of Peace of Amiens and by the new regulation. And then here by this time we also witnessed the arrival of the founder of Escuela Nautica, Francisco Muñoz. He was only assigned to the colony by 1788, but in his short time here, he already already got the royal order to establish a nautical school because he recognized the ineptitude and lack of skill in the colony. So now the final factor here is the economic reorientation. In the Bourbon Reforms, we saw the adoption of agriculture for the colonies, as mentioned by George Canizares Esguerra. The new wealth of the Americas suddenly turned green, and that's what we'll all witness with the Spanish Philippines. Okay, what's the role of the nautical school? In the 1799, we saw it in the opening there in the nautical school. It was mentioned that the nautical school would assist in the transportation of agricultural products around the world. And in Spain, we saw here mentioned by the Secretary of the Navy, José Vázquez Figuera, that the importance of pilots for the trade of empire. Now, when it comes to the Philippines, the Escuela Nautica should have been established way earlier, but it was shelved by the consulado because from a royal order from Spain, and they didn't challenge it. It was only in 1816 that they serious consultation resumed, because with the growth of the export agriculture, again, it was witnessed the unleash a huge demand for pilots, and also as mentioned, by 1830, agriculture would dominate Philippine economy. Anyway, here in 1860, we could see here already the consulado emphasizing. Again, previously, it was not that important to them, but by 1816, with the change of the political economy in the colony, the importance of agriculture, they already want to establish a nautical school.
Hi, Philip. Sorry,
Yes.
I may have to
Okay, here.
request you to end the presentation
Okay.
so as to accommodate the other
Here.
presenters.
Anyway, again, here's the conclusion. Okay, what was important for the establishment of Escuela Nautica? Here is the Bourbon Reforms. Diba? Again, the free trade, export agriculture, the ennoblement of piloting, the global official policy. But this didn't happen instantaneously, especially export agriculture in the Philippines. So it took by the 19th century to establish Escuela Nautica.
Hello again, and I'm very glad to be given this opportunity to talk about something that I did as part of my dissertation for my PhD biology degree here in Ateneo de Manila University. And this is just one aspect of it. Essentially, what I worked on was as comprehensive as I could cover wildlife trade or illegal wildlife trafficking in the Philippines or involving the Philippines as source, destination, and transit point. And for that, I wanted to give it a historical perspective. I believe that it's very important for us to do that, particularly for topics in biology that involve biodiversity conservation, given how important it is for us to get a glimpse of trends or historical trends in biodiversity and the utilization of these resources, particularly given that overexploitation is one of the major drivers of extinction, not only in the Philippines, but in the whole world. Okay. So let's begin with the definition of wildlife trade first. Okay, what is it? It's basically the global trade of animals and plants or parts derived from these organisms for a variety of purposes. Okay, you may have the pet trade, used for cultural items, pharmaceuticals, food, clothing, jewelry, so on and so forth. And these are driven by economic and social needs. How big is this industry? Okay, in 2008, it was estimated that the combined global value of legal wildlife trade was 24.5 billion US dollars. And that's according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And take note, that is just the legal wildlife trade. We don't really have concrete figures for the illegal trade by virtue of its nature as being underground. Okay. In the Philippines, just to give you an idea, as of 2018, the estimated value of illegal wildlife trade is 50 billion Philippine pesos or 1 billion US dollars. Okay. In fact, it's so large that wildlife trafficking is now largely considered by the UNODC, the aforementioned group or agency, as a specialized area of organized crime alongside trade in weapons, drugs, and humans. Now, the Philippines has been involved in global wildlife trade for quite a long time. It's currently recognized as a significant source, destination, and transit point for a wide variety of species that are on different levels of being threatened, whether they're just threatened, endangered, or critically endangered. Here you see a few of the organisms that are actively and very much targeted in the illegal wildlife trade. You have corals, you have giant clams, you have primates, particularly for scientific purposes. Okay, you have parrots. That's the group of birds that is most implicated in the illegal wildlife trade. Butterflies among insects, sea turtles, of course, but also there are freshwater turtles that are very much being traded illegally, and also seahorses. There's a very active seahorse trade internationally, particularly for traditional Chinese medicine or TCM. Now, we do know, of course, that the Philippines has been involved in animal trade with its neighbors since even before the Spanish colonial period. Okay, according to some texts, as early as the 10th century, chiefdoms of the archipelago have been trading in a wide variety of organisms, okay, including pearls from giant clams, beeswax, and bird's nest. And we will see later on that this bird's nest trade has continued, okay, up to the present and throughout the Spanish and American colonial periods. We cannot underestimate the value of primary historical texts and historical texts in general, for that matter, in giving us a better idea or a better picture of trends in biology. Okay, but in particular, I believe that for biodiversity studies and conservation studies, such historical perspective is very important. Okay, for instance, in 2019, Miller et al. Studied over 150 years of trade of sea turtles in Southeast Asia using anatomical structures collected from museums and also archival text. And they were able to determine that the real amount of trade over those 150 years is probably as much as 6 times the estimated trade based on prior studies. Okay, so it can really give us a glimpse of the bigger picture, so to speak, in terms of how big wildlife trade really is. So just as, in fact, this forms the first chapter of my dissertation, I wanted to see what the trends are, or what the historical trends were in animal trade, I should say, involving the Philippines during the Spanish colonial period in particular, but I also looked at the early American colonial period just to see if some of these trends were continued. So essentially, I looked at 2 sources. The first one is the Philippine Islands, which of course is very popular among historians. It's written by Blair and Robertson. Okay, and there's a very helpful index there that allowed me to look for animal-related terms and trade-related terms across 55 volumes of the books, and that's essentially what I did. Okay, and then I did some analysis on how often particular groups of animals appeared in the literature. Okay, as for the American colonial period, I looked at the period from 1899 to 1905, particularly from the reports of the Philippine Commission to the U.S. government, because these volumes of the report actually had tables worth of data on what particular animal and animal products were traded along with monetary values of such. So here are some of the more important results. So we see here that out of the 209 mentions of animals across the 55 volumes, most were mammals, around 53%. And most of these were livestock, as expected, because during this time, livestock trade was really flourishing all around the world, particularly in Europe. However, it bears noting that there were also wild animals among the trade, particularly the Asian palm civet, probably Paradoxus hermaphroditus, which is a threatened species now, okay, as well as derivatives like skins of various mammals, musk from the musk deer, okay, bezoar, ambergris from whales, horns, okay, and various other derivatives from wild mammals. And it's very interesting that in one particular part or one particular volume of the text, an observer mentioned that there was a growing concern as to the dwindling population of deer because of overhunting and overexploitation. Now, in terms of where a lot of the trade is happened, a lot of it was actually domestic. Okay, but you can see that there are other countries that are involved in the trade, and China figures prominently in this trade, and that's not surprising again because pre-Spanish colonial period we were already very actively trading with China. Now, in terms of the numbers of mentions of particular groups, the term fowl was mentioned most often at 15 times from that period, from 1590 to 1621. There were also mentions of swine, horses, and similar animals like cattle. Again, it was livestock dominated. But there were still exotic derivatives like ivory, okay, given the religious nature of our culture, particularly during the Spanish colonial period. Most of the ivory trade went into building the statues of saints, okay, like what we call the santos. Okay, we also have bird's nest figuring prominently here in terms of numbers of mentions at least. And it's worth noting that Aerodramus, which is the genus of bird from which we get bird's nest, is not protected by any international law, particularly the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, or what we call CITES, which should be regulating legal trade. And turtle shells, whether from freshwater or marine specimens, have been very actively traded, both legally and illegally. Of course, it's worth mentioning that during this time, there was no very strong distinction between what is legal and illegal trade. Okay, so we're not attempting to make that distinction here. Okay, but turtle shells have been traded for a very long time, and particularly that's for traditional Chinese medicine. food, and even ornamentation. Okay. I failed to mention, just to quickly go back, that echinoderms figured in the this particular slide. You see there the echinoderms. That's a purely sea cucumber trade, the trepang, which has been traded even as early as the pre-Spanish colonial period. In fact, it stretches all the way back to the Ming Dynasty, the 1300 BC. Okay, so that's how old the trade is, and yet the sea cucumber is not protected by international regulations like CITES or even the red list. There's only one species, I believe, of sea cucumber in the IUCN red list. Okay, there are animals that were mentioned in the text that are protected by CITES. Okay, and these are those organisms. Those that are not, those that did not exist in the Philippines at that time were probably traded through the Philippines. Okay, but here you can see the natures of the traded products, and corals and sea turtles are here, but the other organisms that were actively traded, like the like the Aerodromus, which is the source of bird's nest, and several others are not here, and of course should be reassessed in terms of their being cited or being included in the appendices of CITES. Okay. Here, during the American colonial period, again, this is from 1901 to 1905. You see that it still has a lot of livestock, but whereas the Spanish colonial period was characterized by a livestock-dominated trade, here we begin to see a dominance of animal derivatives. We have trepang still figuring prominently here, as well as turtle shells. And here we don't really make a distinction between marine and freshwater turtles. Okay, we have other shells like mother of pearl. Okay, we have other shells here. The shells except mother of pearl and turtle refers mostly to bivalve shells, particularly giant clam shells. But mother of pearl, as you can see here, has the biggest monetary value, and the mother of pearl is a product called nacre from the shells of various bivalve and gastropod species. These are mollusks that are shelled, and they have a shiny surface on the inner layer of their shell. And you can see here how significant the trade was. Okay, in current times, the trade for wild mother of pearl is not as big as it used to be, because there are a lot of ways to synthesize it artificially. Okay. Now here you can see the significant dip in values of trade from 1901 onward. I just wanted to show this because it's probably a good indication that certain legislations can actually curb wildlife trade, because the Lacey Act was passed in 1900, which served to curb the entry of exotic species into the US market. And that's probably why there was this significant decrease from 1901 to 1902, and then a further decrease onward to 1905. Okay. Now, why was wildlife trade common or prominent during this time? It shouldn't be surprising, given that during the period of expansion and colonization, there was a prevalent belief among many people that natural resources are unlimited. Okay? It's not a matter of how many resources are there. It's a matter of how quickly you can exploit them, which is a far cry from the mercantile system which existed before, which is more deliberately aware of and cognizant of limitations in biological resources. Now, essentially, the main point of this study is that there are several threatened and heavily exploited animal taxa, okay, that have been historically collected since the Spanish colonial period. Okay, so that's a good 500 plus years, and have been exported from the country. Okay, and what's alarming about this is that a lot of these organisms are not necessarily protected by international laws. Like I mentioned, bird's nest is not part of the CITES appendices. You don't have sea cucumbers in the CITES appendices. Paradoxus hermaphroditus, or the Asian palm civet, is in the IUCN red list, but it's only listed as least concern. Okay, and in the Philippine red list, it's not even listed. Okay, despite having dwindling populations ever since the Spanish colonial period. Okay, so my recommendations, coming from this study, really, I just wanted to provide an initial historical perspective, a preliminary one, in other parts or in other chapters of my dissertation, I went on to cover more recent trends from the 1970s onward. Okay, but it would be worthwhile to have values like volumes, for example. That's the greatest limitation of the source that I used, because there weren't any monetary values or volumes in terms of how many of a particular animal was traded. So I couldn't really compare it with the current or more modern records, which do have volumes, but that would be more worthwhile. And so government records from the Spanish colonial period would be a treasure field of data in this regard. It's very important to perform more research on trends in wild populations, because while we do know that trade has been existing for quite a long time based on the information that I've shown, it's still very important for us to assess actual population or demographic trends in the wild populations of these organisms. Okay, because ultimately what we're trying to curb here is capture from the wild, or extraction from the wild. It's also important to consider the feasibility of including the various animals that I mentioned in the appendices of CITES. However, as a lot of you probably know, it's very difficult to get organisms added into CITES because it's a largely political type of exercise, and there's a lot of resistance from countries that have been historically involved in the trade, particularly China and Japan. Okay, especially when it comes to marine organisms. But it's probably high time to start considering lobbying for the inclusion of these organisms in the lists, given the historical perspective. Now, I'd just like to end by saying that it's very important for us to look at wildlife trade, not only from a historical perspective, but the multiple research gaps about it. I mean, the current pandemic that we are in, the COVID-19 pandemic, has been linked to wildlife consumption. Okay, so if that doesn't teach us that it's important for us to curb wildlife extraction and consumption, I don't know what will, but it's very much a worthwhile endeavor to try to find out how we can do that. Thank you.
So let me just begin by saying that my topic is all about opium to Mindanao, revenue farming in the southern frontier of the Spanish Philippines. So let me just read the abstract. Well, the current historiographical narrative on the opium traffic in the southern Philippines has been seen through the lens of the dynamic regional trading networks associated with the Sulu Zone. There's been little research and discussion in connection with the expansion of the Spanish opium regime into what it deemed were its southern frontiers. As the Spanish colonial state entered the opium business rather late compared to its Southeast Asian counterparts, its expansion into southern Philippines coincided with its push to finally consolidate its political foothold over the archipelago. This paper examines the structure and impact of the colonial state's foray into the revenue farming in the several areas in Mindanao, and how the existence of these frontier concessions could provide a clearer and more holistic understanding of the process and dynamics that characterized Spanish presence at the fringes of its empire in the last half of the 19th century. Over the past decades, there's been some interest in updating our understanding of connections among the histories of commodification, the ethnic Chinese, analyzing processes of imperial expansion into frontiers and feedback, and the centering and decentering of regions in relation to the Philippines on a local, regional, or global scale. This paper attempts to explore how the Spanish opium regime established in the island of Mindanao and surrounding areas attempted to control the opium traffic in the region that could enable us to understand the interplay of local and regional dynamics in the region at the fringes of the Spanish control during the last half of the 19th century. The materials from the Ateneo files at the National Archives of the Philippines, or at least what is left of it, because the Ateneo files on Mindanao there are some parts that are incomplete. So this is why, for example, there will be some limitations in my discussion, will be used in this study. And then this will be the outline. The discussion will first provide an overview of the opium regime, the development of the Mindanao opium farms until the collapse of the Spanish rule, and we'll conclude with a few observations. So let me begin. Okay. Opium revenue farming was among the most lucrative supply and service contracts in 19th century Southeast Asia, defined by the Southeast Asian scholar Howard Dick as the subcontracting by the state to private interests of the sovereign right of tax collection. Revenue farming was supposedly a transitional institution created to allow the state to consolidate its administrative capability through an alliance of convenience with the local business elite, since the bureaucracy may not have been numerically able to deal with the task. Various names were used to describe it in the Philippines, such as estancamiento del opio, contrata de anfion, renta de anfion, ramo de anfion, servicio del arriendo de la fumaderos de opio. Essentially, this was a license to publicly operate smoking establishments called Fumaderos Públicos de Anfion or Fumadoria de Anfion, where opium can be exclusively bought at retail and consumed. To convey the idea that the concession was indeed sanctioned by the Spanish government in Madrid, the institution was called in public as the Real Asiento de Opio or Royal Opium Concession. So the Real Asiento de Opio, this is like the equivalent, this is the brand. Okay, so this is like the 7-Eleven. So let me just show you a picture here, like this. So you can see this is one from Zamboanga and this is one from Manila. So so this is more like a brand, like 7-Eleven. Anyway, let me continue. Apian was the Filipino term used for the pure smokable opium known in the Malay world as chandu. From its prohibitionary stance in 1814, the Spanish government eventually relented as it noted that other colonial regimes were profiting from it and that the habit had to be accommodated among the Chinese immigrants who were being tapped to develop the Philippine economy. In 1843, the decision was made to establish the opium farm to be made operational on January 1st, 1844, but strictly limited it to the ethnic Chinese in Manila. However, by 1851, the farm was allowed to operate in the provinces where there was a substantial Chinese population. In 1864, a policy review established that opium consumption did not pose a public health threat and allowed the regulatory regime to continue, but prohibited the private at-home consumption of opium. How many opium consumers were estimated by the government? An 1888 study estimated that 15% of Chinese in the colony were users. If one were to apply, therefore, the 1888 formula to Richard Chu's estimate of 66,000 Chinese in 1886, then there would be around 10,000 Chinese consumers. However, the local inhabitants within the Luzon who benefited from the opium traffic independently from the Spanish-held Philippines were known to be consumers as early as the 17th century. While Philippine opium revenues were limited due to the restricted market compared to its Southeast Asian counterparts, you can see here it's only 4.4%. Okay, it nonetheless provided the colony a steady revenue stream that enabled it to sustain its operations. Okay, so how did the network of opium distribution work? Okay. At the top of the hierarchy stood the private entrepreneur who was referred to as the contratista or asentista, or what we call as the opium revenue farmer. So therefore, when we talk about opium farmer, this is not the person who plants the poppy, but rather this is the contractor who collects, who sells the opium, okay, and pays the government the contract. Okay. The contratista had the exclusive right to import, process, and distribute opium for retail within the designated territory or territories for a set term, which ranged for a few months, 3 years, which eventually became the norm, or initially up to 6 years. We say territories because as the opium revenue farm was only made exclusive for ethnic Chinese in some areas, the consuming population may not have been enough, and so one solution was to combine provinces and offer them as a single block, as we will see in the case of the Mindanao blocks. In exchange for the fixed monthly payment to the government already set by the winning bid, the contratista also acquired the right to enter into arrangements with subcontractors or subarrendadores who possess local knowledge and relieve the former's responsibility of having to go to the area himself. The contratista could also set up central supply depot in the far-flung provinces where the retailers can just directly purchase the opium for retail. These were the so-called Real Asiento de Opio offices and were run by the overseas or the encargados in the employ of the contratista. The retailers, or otherwise known as the estanquilleros, were also issued licenses to operate and transport permits. The opium was then processed and consumed in these licensed fumaderos. In addition, the contratista would also employ agents, or what you call comisionados, who could serve as the contratista's informers or overseas in these areas, and also rely on the help of the government's revenue police, or resguardos, in interdicting smugglers and non-farm opium consumers who were collectively called contrabandistas. So if you're a contrabandista, you're not necessarily a smuggler, okay, but you may be using non-farm opium or a non-licensed opium in that area, because in theory, like say for example, you may have been consuming opium from another province, that's contraband, considered as contraband. In Mindanao, government support came in the form of the tercios de policia or the cuadrilleros. The outsourcing of this right to contratistas enabled the government to reallocate valuable human, logistical, and financial resources as it would have in effect hired a bureaucracy and to some extent a police force. The flip side, however, was that the colonial regime undermined its own sovereignty with the creation of a shadow bureaucracy of managers and enforcers, thus creating an imperio in imperio situation. This tension arises from the conflicting objectives between the government and the contratista. Opium revenue farming thus placed a great deal of political and economic power outside the direct control of the state. Now we proceed to the Mindanao opium farm. Okay. Opium traffic and consumption in Southeast Asia was thought to have predated the coming of the Europeans, and early references to opium consumption in the Philippines begin in the 17th century among the inhabitants of Sulu and Maguindanao. As James Warren notes, the opium trade was one of the commodities responsible in the Sulu Sultanate's rise as a regional power in the 18th century. The formation of the opium farms largely depended on the substantial presence of ethnic Chinese. Here is a table showing estimates for Mindanao, not accounting for the undocumented, as Mr. Galang said. In all, there were 5 farms that were established or planned to be established in Mindanao. They were the Zamboanga block, or the ZPBR block, the Misamis block, the Davao, Jolo, and Iligan. As these territories were frontier areas, the island and the surrounding areas were divided into political military districts. These frontier concessions catered to Chinese residents and migrant traders who were most likely to have come from Singapore, Borneo, Celebes, Sumatra, or Sulu to trade in raw products for export to Sulu or China. It is for the association of trading ties with port cities that the opium scholar Carl Trocky has categorized the Philippine case as following the urban opium farm pattern. In my discussion, I will be excluding Davao because the only documentary evidence located at the Anfion files at the NAP about the farm's existence were about only auction announcements and contract proposals. It is not really known who actually took the contract. That said, let us now turn to the histories of these farms. Okay, the Zamboanga or ZPBR block. Apart from the thriving traffic in opium within the Sulu Sultanate, the first Spanish-controlled opium farm in Mindanao was part of a super block that became operational in 1851 as a result of the move to allow the farm expansion beyond Manila the year before. This super block contract was won by Matias Sanz de Bismanos and encompassed the Bataan, Batangas, Bulacan, Laguna, Pampanga provinces and the cities of Manila, Cavite, and Zamboanga. A merchant and an officer in the colonial militia, Bismanos had earlier business ties with the opium trading company Jardine Matheson. He managed to win another 6-year contract from 1856 to 1862 for 259,000 pesos. As Bismanos was Manila-based, he commissioned the Zamboanga-based Uy Con Lim as the subarrendador in October 1851. With the breakup of the super block in the 1860s, the Zamboanga farm would be reconstituted as part of the block that included Basilan Island, Polyok in Cotabato, and establecimientos along the Rio Grande de Mindanao, present-day Pulangi River, where an active riverine trade existed. By 1870, Zamboanga had a total of 7 fumaderos under the contratista Joaquin Malcampo, the subarrendador Joaquin Malcampo Quiroga. Due to Zamboanga's proximity to the Sulu archipelago, however, the bloc had to contend with issues relating to its profitability. The greatest problem was curbing the traffic in contraband or non-farm opium that directly competed with the official farm. Exacerbating the problem was the Spanish Navy's limited capability in patrolling the seas and coasts in Mindanao and Sulu to catch the contrabandistas. Vismanos complained in 1855 that opium entering into Manila, possibly from Singapore or Hong Kong for export to Jolo, were apparently being diverted by Chinese merchants who then clandestinely sell opium balls by retail in Zamboanga. As a result, no contractor wanted to assume long-term contracts, and the government was forced to grant provisional or interim one-year contracts since it had to continue providing opium for the Chinese residents. In which case, a Manila-based Chinese businessman, Joaquin Tanangco, was awarded the 1870-71 contract with Malcampo as the subcontractor for 60 pesetas daily and offered to extend the interim contract, but with an increased contract price of 2,000 pesetas a month, an indication of increasing consumer base. This was because the Spanish commenced move to finally bring the Sulu Sultanate to recognize Spanish suzerainty, and the start of the bombardment and blockade of Jolo in November 1871 sent Chinese residents fleeing into Zamboanga, taking with them their opium, which led to accusations of introducing contraband opium in the territory. One consequence of the Spanish blockade of the Sulu archipelago was the boom of the ZPR bloc. Initially in the 1860s, the contract was worth 11,000 pesos a year, and in 1867 worth 11,200 pesos, rising to 17,000 in 1872 and reaching 37,000 pesos in 1875 before topping off at 43,680 pesos in 1881. However, this did not last long. Once Sulu submitted to Spanish control, the Spanish government agreed to retain Jolo as a free port and issued an 1877 decree granting tax exemptions for Jolo-based Chinese for 10 years. This spelled disaster for the bloc as bidders did not turn up for 9 auctions. Officials blamed the return of the peace in Jolo as the Chinese returned to Sulu, where it was 25% cheaper. Some enterprising individuals ended up reselling opium illegally within the Zamboanga bloc, including the inhabitants of Mindanao. As a result, the government was forced to reduce the contract price by 10% increments until a bidder could be enticed. In Zamboanga's case, from the initial triennial contract price of 43,680 pesos, it ended up at 24,359.69 pesos by October 1881. In the meantime, however, a 6-month contract extension was enforced, and in the light of the uncertainty, a proposal was made to auction off the provisional contract indefinitely until a winning bidder was found. A Zamboanga-based Chinese won the interim contract. However, the problem of contraband opium because of Jolo prompting the representative of the 1882 contractor to propose to establish the Jolo farm to bring the traffic under control. Another interesting observation was the collaborative partnerships of Manila-based and Zamboanga-based farmers. This was particular too if the winner of the auction was the Manila bidder. In this regard, the Zamboanga partner would be granted subcontracting rights as mostly the case, or as in the case of Lim Cagni during his provisional term, sent 30 commissionados to Zamboanga and Cotabato to police the opium traffic. Next, we talk about the Misamis block. The Misamis block was, as created, covered the whole of Misamis districts, Surigao and Camiguin Island. The 1873 interim contractors representative complained before the government that the Misamis authorities confiscated the opium upon its arrival from Customs House in Cebu in 1874. The reason for the confiscation was that it was supposedly earmarked for the concluding term of the outgoing contractor Seguto Tanting Tiong. However, since the Misamis authorities thought that the incoming contractor, Toribio Gilarte Iyuko's license was already in play, decided to confiscate the 2 chests of opium as suspected contraband without confirming whether Iyuko's term has already begun. This incident resulted in the loss of the outgoing contractor. The contractor, Tan Pintiong, was eventually cleared of wrongdoing. The 1882 cholera epidemic in the Philippines also affected the trade in opium in the district. The politico-military governor of Misamis, Leopoldo Roldan, ordered that all ships, cargoes, and persons bound for Camiguin Island will have to be subjected to quarantine procedures at nearby Mantigue Island. These procedures included the vaccination of persons, unloading of cargo for fumigation, and ventilation of cargo holds, in which case Roldan directed the opium farmer Pastrano to construct a temporary shelter for the opium cargo and other goods bound for Camiguin. Iligan. The Iligan farm was one of the last opium farms to be created in the colony. It was established in the light of the Spanish government's campaign to finally subjugate the Maranao by undertaking the Marawi campaign under the leadership of Governor General Ramon Blanco in 1895. To keep the army supplied and allow Manila Trade with Iligan to develop, it was decided to build a 34-kilometer railway connecting Iligan to Lake Lanao. The plan entailed the importation of 1,000 Chinese workers from Manila to construct the railway. The presence of a substantial number of Chinese laborers would also mean that they needed to be constantly supplied by opium as well. To this effect, a proposal was made to create a special concession that would service the illegal Chinese and the railway workers, and it was estimated that the clientele was sufficient enough for a profitable venture. There were 56 Chinese settlers in Iligan, 280 workers from the military railway project, and 67 more from the military administration staff. As it was thought that the rate of consumption around 60 to 70 pesos worth of opium a month, the opium farmers stood to profit 30 to 40 pesos a month. Thus, a contract was auctioned off, and a Manila-based Chinese, Fermin Villaba Wabuco, was awarded a 1-year provisional contract at 100 pesos a month. However, a protest was lodged by the Misamis block opium farmer Basilio Sembrano Oybondan. Oybondan held that a 75,600 peso triennial contract that theoretically included the Lanao area, and claimed that since the contract preceded the creation of Iligan district as the 7th political military district, Oybondan thought that he had the right to service the Chinese in the area and called for the suspension of the Quabuco contract. It apparently was unsuccessful, as Quabuco's service was still operating in Iligan in December of 1896. The end of empire. When the Philippine Revolution broke out in August of 1896, the widespread panic among civilians brought about by the fighting in the contested areas convinced the ethnic Chinese in the affected towns to either stay put or flee to safer areas for their security, which in this case was Manila, where the Spanish forces were bottled in the defensive position pending the arrival of reinforcements from Spain. Thus, economic activities in the war zones were affected, and so was the opium traffic, as farmers begged to be released from their contractual obligations without penalty, which the government allowed. However, on the areas farther away from Manila, a semblance of normalcy continued, and so did the opium trade. However, when the revolution recommenced in 1898 alongside the Spanish-American War, the opium farms were now significantly disrupted in places as far as Mindanao. Against this backdrop, the opium concessionaires were affected in different ways with the changing dispensation. There were those who opted to discontinue due to the hardships of sustaining the logistics of transporting opium. Others simply found it as money-making opportunity because not only they could fill in the vacuum left by the powerful conglomerates of the pre-war era, they were also able to secure these contracts with lesser value and shorter terms. The factor from the port of Jolo wrote Manila about the wish of the unnamed opium farmer for Jolo to directly import the opium from Singapore in April 1898, as it was discovered that the previous one bought some already. Manila warned the contractor not to jeopardize the policy by buying direct. It should be noted, however, that since Jolo was considered a free port and there was an active opium traffic between Singapore and Jolo, the policy did not really matter. It was estimated that opium entering Sulu early in the 19th century, where 6 chests of Benares opium, 40 balls each, were bought annually and increasing to 30 over the next 2 decades. A British colony of Labuan's opium trade with Sulu beginning in 1860 sold 7 to 8 chests annually. And in 1898, it amounted to 32 chests, 30 in 1899, 54 in 1900, 10 in 1901, 30 in 1902, and 17 in the first 3 quarters of 1903. As late as March 1898, the Zamboanga block was being auctioned off for 30,000 pesos for 3 years. Since there were no bidders for the 5th time, the outgoing Chinese contractor Guapaco proposed to become the interim farmer in April until the auction became successful. In exchange, he paid 1,066 pesos a month. This was actually a strategy adopted by farmers who felt that the price was too high. They would boycott the biddings, and in response, the government would then lower the bid until a bidder was found. All was well until June of 1898 when no payment was made. When the local branch of the Treasury pressed Guapaco's assistant, the latter replied that the former gave him instructions not to, as he was going to pay for it in Manila. A new bidder from Zamboanga, Don Luis Montojo, paid 33,510 pesos for a 3-year contract, but could not take over pending the confirmation of him as the sole winner by the Spanish central government that now relocated to Iloilo. In the meantime, the governor of Zamboanga province complained in November 1898 that Guapaco was still not paying up, hence placing whatever remaining opium revenue in jeopardy. Our final documentation on this matter was a proposal made by the Manila-based individual proposing to the Spanish government his bid for the concession at 250 pesos monthly. In conclusion, in his book on secret trades, porous borders, the scholar Eric Tagliacozzo called for a deeper analysis on how trade of legal and contraband goods change meanings as they cross colonial frontier areas, and how the state's attempts to gain control over these were influenced by a number of factors such as military capabilities, strategic priorities, and economic benefit. Spanish expansion into the colony's southern frontiers was part of an attempt to complete the political consolidation of the colony. But this could only happen if it had an economic base that can sustain the expenditures of a military campaign and strong local bureaucratic presence. The colony's archipelagic nature and limited presence in the frontier meant that it had to rely on different strategies in order to establish control. Revenue farming was one of those tools used as an indirect way of achieving it. The emergence of the Zamboanga opium block heralded an attempt to both surveil and make money off the migrating Chinese traders crossing from the Sulu area into Mindanao Island. Since opium was an addictive substance, individuals would not likely stray away from places where they could secure a steady supply, or at least this was how speculators like Vismanos would have thought. This was why probably Manila-based contractors were trustful enough to enter into business partnerships with locals in faraway places, even when the risk was high. Yet, the challenge of competing with next to a free port area like Jolo made it very difficult to really profit from the trade, given the fact that they had to pay the license to the government, not to mention the fact that political events like the Jolo campaign only provided a temporary boom in the fortunes of the Zamboanga block. Boycotting auctions in order to force or bully the government into drastically lowering the opening bid of triennial contracts was a response for Zamboanga with a record 18 failed auctions in 1891. Alternatively, however, a second tactic was developed by bidding for provisional or interim contracts, which were short to medium-term contracts that lessened the risks. Other supervening factors, such as the cholera epidemic in 1882, Misamis, and the Marawi campaign of 1895, also demonstrated how events can also affect the configuration of the opium farm. The hiring of a large number of Chinese laborers for the military railway project also meant that the fumadero was indispensable. However, as the Misamis opium farmers' complaint demonstrated, space was also being contested and negotiated. In conclusion, allow me to adopt a quote from Tagliacozzo. Quote, "The changing structures of trade in the Southeast Asian locale permit a historical examination of several crucial questions about the nature of commerce and power. Some of the most important of these questions focus on the character of commodities themselves, namely how they are defined by different actors in different contexts and how culture comes to bear on their movement in an area of power inequality." Thank you.
Thank you, Ferdinand, and thank you to all our 4 presenters. And the floor is now open for anyone in the audience to ask questions. You may use the raise your hand button here in Zoom. Alternatively, you can type in your questions via the chat box. Anyone?
Oh, hi.
Hi.
There's a question for me.
Yes, yeah, Ronald. There's a question posted on Facebook from Nicolo Lodovice asking, thank you for your presentation. This is in line with your last slide about the supposed exploitation of wild animals. How do you operationalize the term exploitation? While I agree that there is a need to do extensive research about wild animal trade, it cannot be detached from the economies and structures it operated in. Why did wildlife trade exist to begin with, and how were such market flows disrupted or continued? So Ronald, yeah, please go ahead. You may answer the question.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Nicolo. Thank you for that question. Definitely, it can't be uncoupled from economic considerations. In fact, it's as much an economic problem as it is a social one and a biological one. Okay. That's the reason why I gave you values. Like I said, that it's worth this much in terms of the extent to which the industry is proliferating, okay, whether it's a legal or illegal trade. Okay. Since we're talking here about terminology with regard to the wildlife trade, again, it's important to distinguish between legal and illegal. Okay. Legal trade, as suggested by the term itself, well, it's not illegal, but it is regulated. Okay. Particularly again by the CITES, which is responsible for regulating legal trade through the permitting system. Okay, for instance, if a particular country wants to trade with another country on wildlife, okay, or on organisms in general, then they have to go through that permitting system. Okay, there are a lot of limitations with CITES. For example, they deal only with international trade, and they have only a very limited number of threatened species in their list. Okay. With regard to wildlife laws in the Philippines, they're very clear. RA 9147, the Wildlife Resources Act, is very clear that extraction from the wild is illegal. Extraction of organisms or of animals and plants from the wild is illegal unless you have a permit from the DENR, which could be a loophole from a legal perspective, and that's one of the more problematic things, because one of the usual excuses is that I'll be getting this wildlife from the wild, then I'll be breeding it in captivity so that I could keep on selling the offspring of that captive bred organism, okay, which is a flourishing trade right now, even on Facebook, okay, but that's dangerous because there's a lot of potential loopholes again, where a lot of people claim that they are selling captive bred organisms, but in fact they're selling wild caught organisms. Yeah, so wildlife trade began to exist because there's a need for it, and there are so many different reasons why people would want to buy wildlife. It can be as simple as reputation. Okay, a lot of people actually claim to buy wildlife because it raises their status. Okay, but it can also be for food, can be for pharmaceutical use, can be for scientific purposes, like the proliferation of primate trade or monkey trade is primarily for clinical trials and such. There's so much more to discuss, but just to keep the answer short, I'll probably end it there. I hope I was able to address the question somewhat.
Yeah, thanks, Ronald. And to Ferdinand, here's a question from Lola Elizalde. How was the relation between Mindanao and Sulu in the opium trade? Ferdinand?
Yeah, thank you for the question. If we are talking about the existing trade between Mindanao and Sulu, even before, it was already pre-existing. It was already existing even, even before the Spanish powers decided to assert their presence there. We do know that a lively opium trade may have been occurring in Southeast Asia and in that area. In fact, for example, the Chinese thought that the area was the source of opium, and so there was a very active trade between them. As of course, and this story is discussed by Warren in his book The Sulu Zone and his Iranon and Balangingi book. But however, if you're talking about the interventions made from the Spanish side, okay, and their attempts to control the opium traffic, then it's a totally different thing. For example, as I mentioned in the paper, the Spanish contractors were already complaining with the fact that they could not stop the opium traffic coming and going between Mindanao and Sulu. In fact, one of the contractors in Zamboanga suggested that, hey, if we cannot stop the traffic, why not put up an opium farm in Jolo? At least by putting up an opium farm in Jolo, we can take control of the traffic. We can partly control the traffic there. Of course, that was still a fail, as we all know, because despite the fact that the revolution was, the situation was collapsing, there was a brisk trade between Sulu and Singapore.
Thank you, Ferdinand.
Yeah.
And here's an additional answer from Ronald regarding the earlier question. Wildlife trade operates on the same principles, for example, supply and demand, as other types of trade. Exploitation is essentially extraction of animals and plants from the wild. It could be legal or illegal, but in most countries, that's largely illegal. And here's a comment from Teresita Angsi, who was part of our panel as member of the audience. Just an input for everyone. All 4 papers could be enhanced by Chinese sources, many of which have already been translated. Pearl trading, Galleon trade in silver, how the 2 flowers, opium and tea change global trade, sea urchins and sea cucumbers, bird's nest trading, etc. Maybe we could hear from the other 2 presenters, their comment on Teresita Ang's comments on the use of Chinese sources. Philip, or perhaps Juan, may you comment on the possibility of using Chinese sources in relation to your respective topics? Yes, Juan, you can begin.
Yes, so I entirely agree. I think that Chinese sources are very fundamental when everything that is related with trade with the Philippines. I think that they're extremely useful. For example, they've been for actually establishing the volume of this trade, because it's always been helpful to look at the amounts of silver that is actually arriving in China, because as we know, the Spanish are they're not really interested in recording this kind of data for many reasons. The only problem regarding this is that there is a limitation specifically when it comes to the religious funds themselves, because they're obviously their financing model, because they're obviously based in Manila and all the sources are in Spanish. But I completely agree that Chinese sources probably should feature more prominently in the paper, because they provide such a wealth to everything regarding the trade in general. So I entirely agree with that.
Thank you, Juan. How about Philip?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
I also agree with this observation that expanding in Chinese sources may enhance our studies. But I'm also interested in a different area, because for me, the Escuela Nautica, the Spaniards have a racist attitude towards the Chinese, and I think even the first professor of Escuela Nautica was not inclined to teach the Chinese. That's I want to see if was there any Chinese who wanted to study at Escuela Nautica.
Okay. So that's thank you, Philip, for responding to Teresita Angsi's comments. Can we have other questions? We still have room for additional questions or maybe comments on the four papers presented in this panel. Additional questions or maybe additional input from our presenters?
Hi.
Yes, Ronald. Yes.
Yeah, maybe I'd
Go
just
ahead.
like to respond also to the comment by Mr. Teresita Angsi. I definitely agree that getting data on data from China, from Chinese sources, I should say, would be very, very important in this context, given how much involved China is in our trade, particularly on animals and derived sources from animals, especially in the context of TCM or traditional Chinese medicine. So moving forward, that's something that I will definitely think about when I keep on pursuing this this type of research. So thank you for that suggestion.
Or maybe Ferdinand can also weigh in on the issue of use of Chinese sources.
Yes, I totally agree that Chinese sources can be used for further research. Because, like, for example, in researching the opium trade in the Philippines or the opium traffic in the Philippines, one of the fundamental problems is that the Anfion archives do not really, while they talk about more about the structure, they don't really go deep in talking about, they don't really reveal a lot about the social about the social lives of people who are who are the consumers. It's as if the consumers are not there, and you can only see them whenever there is what you call, they're engaged in the criminal cases or contraband cases, but otherwise they're not. It's very difficult to tease out, like, say, for example, um, the technical terms that they use amongst themselves in Manila, for example. So that would be something that should be researched on, and hopefully, Chinese sources will be able to shed more light into how opium was consumed by the Chinese themselves preferably in the Philippines, because from the sources that I'm seeing as of now, there's not really there's not really any solid description on the terms that are being used by them, apart from the word apian. Okay, so say yes, definitely Chinese sources will definitely play a role.
And Ferdinand, as a follow-up to that, we have another follow-up question. Can you elaborate on the underworld of opium farming, as James Rush has shown in Opium to Java?
They're talking about if they're talking about the contraband trade, well, there are different there are different ways by which the contraband trade was happening. Like, say, for example, of course, in the southern frontier, contraband meant the ones that are coming from Sulu, right? because that's basically non-farm opium. And since Sulu was at this point up to the 1870s an independent an independent state altogether, the colonial government could not make any solid incursions to stop that illegal trade. And since it was very difficult to police the coasts and the area, traffic was moving into Sulu freely and into the rest of the Mindanao. However, again, if we are to talk about James's Russia book, there are also, but this is not really more on Mindanao. It's really more in the other places in Luzon, for example. In Luzon, for example, there were because there were opium farmers that were located just next to each other in the neighboring provinces. Okay, so one of the ways by which rival opium farmers will undercut each other is that they would sell the black market opium. They would sell opium there, okay, to undercut or undermine the other farmer. This is why, for example, one of the most famous opium farmers in Central who made a very good career, Ramon Aelye, was complaining every now and then to the colonial government that, hey, the rival opium farmers, because he once held a lot of blocks there in Central Luzon, and he was saying that he was having a very difficult time managing the farms because the other rivals were trying to undercut him. And so he was trying to press the government to take more action. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ferdinand. We still have time to answer a few more questions. Anyone from the audience? One or two questions to end the panel. Okay, here's a follow-up from our social media pages. For one, could you explain what happened to the funds when the Galleon Trade ended?
So yeah, thank you. That is a really interesting question. So one of the amazing things about these funds is that they last extremely long. So for example, these funds obviously don't have an expiration date because they technically, since they're in canon law, they technically belong to the soul of the dead. That means that I've seen some funds in the archives of the Franciscans, for example, in Madrid, that are still active in 1916 and later. Some of this, like what happens to some of the funds is they just go on in history for a really long time. So, for example, the House of Mercy in 1838 petitioned to change its business model to premium insurance once the Galleon had finished, because then there was an expansion of trade, as we've seen in other presentations, and premium insurance made sense. But it doesn't really tell what happened to the funds. The funds just seem to continue existing continuously, and it is the corporations, these brotherhoods, that seem to change the business model. Instead, other funds are actually redeemed eventually. So, for example, there's two funds that Francisco Carrillo y Peredo opens in 1740s for the municipality of Manila to finance the waterworks and the sewage of the city, and they're finally redeemed in 1874 or 73. And other funds, for example, when the Banco Hispano-Filipino is created in the 1850s, it's actually opened from proceeds from the legacy fund, which means that they're still operating. It's really unknown what happens to the funds themselves, because they seem to keep operating until very, very late. way beyond this time period. What seems to happen instead is that they change their business model. Yeah, I hope that that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Juan. And with that, I think we can end the panel here. Thank you very much to our four presenters, Juan, Ferdinand, Philip, and Ronald, for your insightful presentations. We are ending the conference for today, day one, but we do have day two. Tomorrow we will begin the first session of day two, session 6 at 8 a.m. Manila time. So we look forward to seeing you there as well. We are inviting you to attend all the sessions. We do have a second keynote address by Father Rene Javellana at 10:15 a.m. We have a lot of things in store for you on the second day, and we look forward to meeting you there. And so I would like to end the panel, end the session by saying thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.